There is rarely a single moment when it becomes clear. No announcement, no calendar date circled in red. It does not arrive with a diagnosis or a dramatic event. It slips in quietly, the way a change in weather does, sensed more than observed. One day you notice that decisions feel slightly heavier, as if they require justification now. Not because you doubt yourself, but because others seem to expect an explanation. You cannot point to when this started. You only know that it did. Retirement was described as freedom. Years ago, the word carried a particular shine. Freedom from schedules, from supervisors, from alarm clocks, from obligations that did not belong to you. Freedom to choose how the day unfolds, freedom to wake without urgency. That promise still exists on paper, but the lived experience is often different, not worse in a dramatic way, just altered, subtly narrowed. The space where choice once lived feels rearranged. You wake up, and the day is open. That should feel expansive. Instead, it sometimes feels oddly supervised, not by anyone explicitly, by expectations that hover, by well-meaning assumptions, by questions that arrive dressed as concern. Are you sure you should be driving today? Do you want help with that? Maybe it would be easier if someone handled this for you. These are not attacks. They are offered gently, kindly, almost lovingly. And yet, over time, they begin to shape the edges of your autonomy. Nothing has been taken by force. That is the unsettling part. You still choose what to eat. You still choose what to wear. You still choose when to leave the house. But the texture of those choices has changed. They are no longer assumed to be yours by default. They are checked, confirmed, sometimes second-guessed, not openly, just enough to register. You notice it in language first. The tone shifts. People begin to explain things you already understand. They slow their speech, not out of rudeness but habit. They offer reminders you did not ask for. They phrase suggestions as necessities. It is subtle enough that objecting would feel unreasonable. After all, they are only trying to help. And you do not want to seem difficult. You have spent a lifetime being capable, being reasonable, being someone others could rely on. That instinct does not disappear. So you let small things pass. You let someone else make the phone call. You let someone else handle the appointment. You let someone else decide the route. Each time it feels insignificant, even practical. Why argue when it does not matter? Why insist when the outcome is the same? But slowly, a pattern forms. Not in events, but in posture. A slight leaning back from the center of your own life. There is a quiet moment when you realize that fewer people ask what you want. They ask what is easiest, what is safest, what is best for you as they see it. The question shifts from preference to management. Again, no malice, just efficiency, just concern, just love filtered through fear of loss. You are not being dismissed. You are being handled. This realization does not arrive with anger. It arrives with a faint sense of displacement, as if you are still in the room, but no longer at the head of the table. Conversations happen around you instead of with you. Plans are presented already formed. Your role becomes approval rather than authorship. You can still say no. Of course you can. But saying no now requires energy. It introduces friction. It forces explanation. And sometimes you do not have the patience for that. So you nod. You agree. You go along. It feels easier. And in isolation, it is easier. But something accumulates. A quiet erosion of internal authority. Not because you are incapable, but because the world has adjusted its expectations without telling you. You are still strong, still sharp, still yourself. But the frame around you has shifted. Retirement removes external structure, but it introduces another kind. A social structure built on assumptions about age, about fragility, about decline. Even when none of it applies to you, it hangs in the air. You feel it when people praise you for things that were once ordinary. You feel it when competence is treated as surprising. You feel it when independence is framed as impressive rather than normal. There is a strange loneliness in this phase, not the loneliness of isolation, but the loneliness of being misunderstood, of having your inner life remain intact while the outside world slowly redraws you. You are still the same person who solved problems, made decisions, carried responsibility, but now those qualities are remembered more than relied upon. You begin to notice that routines, once chosen freely, become expectations imposed gently. Eat at this time, rest more, avoid that, stick to this schedule. Again, none of it is unreasonable. Taken individually, it all makes sense. But together, it creates a quiet script, a version of life where spontaneity feels discouraged, where deviation requires justification, where choice is tolerated but not trusted. This is the moment of awareness, not crisis, not loss, just recognition that something has shifted, that freedom, promised loudly, has been replaced by a softer form of containment, not enforced by rules, but by relationships, by care, by language, by habit. You are not being controlled, and yet you are no longer fully assumed to be in control. The most unsettling part is how easy it is to accept, how natural it feels to step back a little, to let others take the lead. After all, you have earned rest, you have earned ease, you have earned the right not to fight every small battle. And that is true. But rest can quietly turn into retreat. Ease can quietly turn into passivity. And without noticing, the center of gravity moves away from you. There is no villain here, no enemy to confront. That is what makes it difficult to name. Society means well. Family means well. Even you mean well when you choose the path of least resistance. But awareness begins when you notice the cost, not a dramatic cost, a subtle one. The cost of no longer being the unquestioned author of your own days. You feel it when you hesitate before making a decision, wondering how it will be received. You feel it when you anticipate objections before they are voiced. You feel it when you adjust your desires to fit what seems acceptable. These are small internal movements, almost invisible. But they matter, because autonomy is not lost in a single moment. It is diluted. This is not about fighting back. It is not about reclaiming youth or proving strength. It is about noticing the quiet transfer of authority, the moment when you stop assuming your choices require no defense, the moment when your inner voice becomes cautious instead of certain. Awareness does not demand action yet. It only demands honesty. Something has shifted, nothing dramatic has happened, and yet something is missing. At first, the pattern is difficult to see because it does not announce itself. It repeats softly. It hides inside good intentions. It arrives wearing the language of care. You only notice it after enough moments stacked together, each one harmless on its own, each one slightly displacing you from the center. Recognition does not feel like discovery. It feels like remembering something you already sensed but avoided naming. You begin to see how help changes shape, how it starts as support and slowly becomes direction. Not through force, but through momentum. Someone offers to take something off your plate. You accept, grateful. The next time, they do not ask. They assume. It feels efficient, it feels practical. And then one day you realize that an entire category of decisions no longer reaches you at all. Concern has its own gravity. It pulls decisions toward the people who worry the most. Not necessarily the people most qualified or most attuned to what you want, but the ones most uncomfortable with uncertainty. Age amplifies this. People fear what might happen to you more than they respect what is happening inside you. So they move closer, they monitor, they anticipate, they preempt. All of it framed as protection. Language reveals the shift before behavior does. Words like should appear more often. It might be better if. Maybe it is time to. We thought it would be easier. These phrases do not invite discussion. They present conclusions gently. You are included in the conversation, but not in the formation of the outcome. You are informed rather than consulted. You notice how often safety is used as the final argument. Safety ends debate. Once safety is invoked, preference becomes secondary. Choice becomes negotiable. And because you are not reckless, because you have always valued responsibility, you hesitate to challenge it. You do not want to seem careless with your own well-being. You do not want to be the reason someone worries. This is how permission quietly replaces autonomy, not because anyone demands it, but because it becomes socially easier to comply than to assert. You begin to feel that insisting on your way requires justification, while accepting someone else's way requires none. The burden of explanation shifts onto you, and slowly, unconsciously you adjust. You recognize how routines become scripts written by others, appointments scheduled without asking if the time works, plans made with the assumption you will adapt. Your calendar fills with obligations that were decided for you, even if they are technically for your benefit. You still have veto power, but vetoing feels disruptive. It introduces discomfort. It requires explanation, so you reserve it for what truly matters, and what truly matters shrinks. You see how quickly independence is reframed as stubbornness, how preference is reframed as resistance, how confidence is reframed as denial. These are not accusations. They are implications. They sit beneath the surface of conversations. You feel them more than you hear them, and because you are thoughtful, because you have spent a lifetime reading rooms and navigating dynamics, you respond by softening yourself. Recognition deepens when you notice how your inner dialogue changes. You start asking yourself whether something is worth pushing for. Not because you doubt its value to you, but because you anticipate the reaction it might provoke. You pre-negotiate internally. You compromise before the conversation even happens. This is not submission, it is adaptation. But adaptation has a cost. Help becomes control not when it is offered, but when it is assumed. When your capacity is quietly downgraded in the minds of others. When your past competence is acknowledged, but your present authority is questioned. People remember what you were capable of, but they no longer rely on it. They treat it as a chapter that has closed. You recognize the pattern in small exchanges. Someone answers a question directed at you. Someone explains your own habits to you. Someone makes a decision and then checks if you are okay with it, rather than asking what you want. These moments are brief, easy to dismiss, but together they form a map. You see how often your agreement is interpreted as preference, how silence is interpreted as consent, how flexibility is interpreted as indifference. You realize that by being easy to accommodate, you have made it easy to overlook you, not out of disrespect, but out of efficiency. The world moves quickly, and those who do not assert their edges are reshaped by it. Recognition is uncomfortable because it reveals your own role, not blame, just participation. You see how often you chose harmony over authorship, how often you let decisions slide because they seemed minor, how often you told yourself it did not matter. And perhaps it did not, individually, but cumulatively, it mattered more than you expected. There is a particular moment when this becomes clear. It is not dramatic. It might happen in a conversation where plans are discussed as if already settled, or when someone expresses surprise that you have an opinion on something they assumed was no longer your concern, or when you realize you have not made a certain kind of decision in a long time, and you are not sure when that stopped. You recognize how age changes the direction of questions. Earlier in life, people asked what you were going to do. Now they ask what you are comfortable with. The difference is subtle but profound. One assumes agency, the other assumes limitation. And while comfort matters, it is not the same as choice. You begin to see how systems are built to streamline you. Healthcare, family logistics, social expectations. They all operate more smoothly when decisions flow toward a central manager. And as you age, you are gently nudged out of that role, not expelled, just eased aside. It is presented as relief, less responsibility, less burden. But responsibility is also authority. And when it is removed, something essential goes with it. Recognition does not lead to anger. It leads to clarity, a quiet understanding of how autonomy is negotiated away in increments, how dignity fades not through humiliation, but through omission, how the moment people stop asking is not sudden but gradual. You recognize that this is not about others taking something from you. It is about how the world responds to age with assumptions, and how easy it is to cooperate with those assumptions in the name of peace. You see that help is not neutral. It carries with it an implicit hierarchy. The helper decides what matters. The helped adapts. This realization does not demand confrontation. It does not ask you to push back loudly. It simply asks you to see clearly, to recognize the pattern for what it is, to notice when concern crosses into control, when support crosses into substitution, when your voice is included only after decisions are made. Recognition is the moment you stop telling yourself that nothing has changed. It is the moment you acknowledge that something has. That autonomy once assumed is now conditional. and that the condition is often your willingness to accept what is offered without question. You see it now, not as a threat, but as a landscape, a terrain you are moving through. And once seen, it cannot be unseen. The loss does not arrive as grief. It does not announce itself with sadness or despair. It arrives as a dull weight, carried quietly, often mistaken for fatigue. You feel it most in moments when you are spoken to differently, not rudely, not dismissively, but with a softness that was not there before, a carefulness, as if your edges have been rounded without your consent, as if your presence now requires accommodation rather than engagement. You notice how conversations adjust around you, the pace slows, the topics narrow, certain subjects are avoided, not because you asked them to be, but because others assume they are no longer yours. Decisions are discussed nearby within earshot, but not fully with you. You are present, but no longer positioned as essential. You are informed after the fact, included as context, not as authority. Being repositioned is not the same as being excluded. That is what makes it difficult to articulate. You are still invited, still considered, still cared for, but the role has changed. You are no longer the one others look to when direction is needed. You are the one others check on. The shift is subtle, but it is unmistakable once felt. There is a particular sting in being managed, not because management implies incompetence, but because it implies replacement. Someone else now holds the overview. Someone else monitors the details. Someone else anticipates outcomes on your behalf. You become a variable in someone else's plan rather than the architect of your own. Even when the plan benefits you, the loss of authorship leaves a residue. You hear it in the way people phrase things: "We will take care of that for you. You do not need to worry about this. We have it handled." These statements are meant to reassure, and they do, temporarily. But reassurance can also signal removal. It tells you that your involvement is no longer necessary, that your concern is optional, that your judgment is secondary. You feel the loss most acutely when your preferences are treated as sentimental rather than decisive, when what you want is acknowledged politely, then set aside in favor of what others think is practical. You are not overruled openly. You are redirected, guided, gently corrected. The message is never that you are wrong. It is that you are no longer central. There is an emotional cost to being spoken to, as if you are fragile when you are not, or as if fragility defines you when it does not. Even when the body changes, the self remains intact. The mind remains capable of weighing risk, of choosing trade-offs, of accepting consequences. But the world grows impatient with that complexity. It prefers simplicity, safety over sovereignty. You notice how your past is referenced more than your present. Stories of what you used to do, what you used to handle, what you were known for. They are told fondly, respectfully, and yet they frame your competence as something completed, something archived. You are honored but no longer relied upon, admired but not entrusted. Loss accumulates in moments of silence, when you stop offering opinions because they are rarely acted on, when you stop initiating plans because they are often reshaped beyond recognition, when you stop correcting assumptions because it feels exhausting to defend your own agency. These silences are not emptiness. They are concessions, each one small, each one reasonable. Together, they form a withdrawal. You become aware of how your emotional reactions are monitored. Concerned glances when you express frustration, gentle reminders to stay calm, subtle cues that strong feelings are no longer expected from you, as if emotional range should narrow with age, as if intensity is inappropriate. You are encouraged to be agreeable, grateful, easy. This creates a quiet tension. You are still alive inside, still opinionated, still capable of anger, joy, desire, ambition. But the social space available for those expressions shrinks. You learn which parts of yourself are welcomed and which are tolerated, and you adapt, not consciously, instinctively, the way one adapts to a room with low ceilings by not standing too tall. Being managed instead of consulted changes how you see yourself. Not immediately, gradually. You begin to question whether your instincts are still valid, whether your preferences are still reasonable, whether insisting on your way is selfish. These doubts do not originate inside you. They are reflections of how others respond. But over time, reflections can become beliefs. You notice the loss of spontaneity, not because you lack energy, but because spontaneity now requires negotiation. You cannot simply decide and act. You must consider logistics, reactions, concerns. You must reassure others before you reassure yourself. The friction builds. Eventually you choose not to initiate, not because you cannot, but because it is easier not to. There is a quiet humiliation in being overprotected, not dramatic, just persistent. It suggests that your judgment cannot be trusted to keep you safe, that others must step in. Even when this is motivated by love, it diminishes something essential. It replaces respect with caution, and caution, when applied indiscriminately, erodes dignity. You feel the loss when your environment is altered without your input. Furniture moved for convenience, systems simplified, choices reduced. All in the name of ease. Your world becomes smoother, but also smaller. Less demanding, less engaging, less yours. You realize that strength is not the first thing to fade. Dignity is. Strength can remain long after dignity has been quietly negotiated away, because dignity requires recognition. It requires being seen as an agent, not a project. And when that recognition falters, the internal sense of self must work harder to remain intact. There is a moment when you hear yourself described in the third person while you are present, not maliciously, casually, as if your perspective is already known or irrelevant. You are talked about, not with. It is brief, it passes, but it lingers. Loss is also felt in how time is managed for you, appointments clustered for efficiency, days structured to minimize inconvenience for others. Your schedule becomes a shared resource rather than a personal one. You are flexible because you have always been flexible, but flexibility becomes expectation, and expectation becomes entitlement. You begin to grieve something you cannot name easily. It is not youth, it is not health, it is not productivity. It is authority over the small, ordinary contours of life. The right to decide without explanation. The assumption that your choices belong to you alone. This loss does not provoke outrage because it arrives wrapped in care. It would feel ungrateful to resist. It would feel dramatic to object. And so, it settles quietly, like dust, barely visible, always present. You are still yourself. That is the paradox. Nothing essential has changed internally. And yet, externally, you are treated as someone else, someone to be guided, managed, protected. And over time, that treatment presses inward. It shapes how you move, how you speak, how you decide. Loss is not always about what is taken. Sometimes it is about what is no longer offered, the chance to lead, the expectation of competence, the assumption of authority. When those disappear quietly, without ceremony, something fundamental is displaced. You do not collapse under this loss, you adapt, you endure, you remain composed. That is what makes it invisible. But invisibility does not mean absence. It means the loss has learned to hide. Clarity does not arrive as revelation. There is no sudden insight that rearranges everything at once. It comes slowly, almost reluctantly, after the weight of loss has been carried long enough to be examined rather than endured. It comes when you stop asking why this happened and begin noticing where you still stand, not externally, but internally, where authority truly lives when everything else has shifted. You realize that what was lost was not the ability to decide, but the assumption that your decisions belong to you without question. That assumption once lived outside you, reinforced by roles, by work, by necessity. When those structures fell away, the assumption was no longer protected. And without noticing, you let others carry it for you, not because you could not, but because it seemed unnecessary to insist. Clarity begins when you see that autonomy was never guaranteed by circumstances. It was supported by them, but it did not originate there. It originated inside, in the quiet certainty that you were allowed to choose without explanation. That certainty can weaken when it is not exercised, not because it disappears, but because it grows unused, like a muscle that still exists, but no longer feels familiar. You begin to understand that dignity is not something others grant or withdraw. Others can respect it or violate it, but they cannot define it unless you let them. The danger was never that people began deciding for you. The danger was that you began to accept their decisions as default. Clarity lives in that distinction. You notice that many of the choices taken from you were not seized. They were surrendered incrementally, not out of weakness but out of accommodation. You see now that accommodation, when repeated without awareness, becomes abdication. And abdication does not require permission. It only requires silence. This realization is not accompanied by blame, not toward yourself, not toward others. Blame would imply conflict. Clarity does not need conflict. It only needs precision. The precision to see where consent was implied rather than given, where agreement replaced authorship, where peace replaced presence. You understand that control does not always announce itself as domination. Sometimes it arrives as convenience, as efficiency, as relief. The promise that you no longer have to carry something. And sometimes that promise is true, but sometimes it removes something you still needed to carry, not because it was heavy, but because it was yours. Clarity is the recognition that autonomy cannot be outsourced without consequence, even when outsourced to people who love you, even when outsourced temporarily. Because autonomy is not about outcomes. It is about posture, about standing inside your own decisions even when they are small, even when they are inefficient, even when they inconvenience others. You begin to see that the question was never whether others were overstepping. The question was whether you were still stepping forward, whether you were still assuming authorship over the shape of your days, whether you were still inhabiting the role of chooser rather than participant. Clarity sharpens when you recognize that aging does not remove your right to risk. It changes the nature of risk, perhaps, but not the right to weigh it. Safety offered without consent is not protection, it is substitution. And substitution, when repeated, teaches others that your judgment is optional. You see now that autonomy does not require confrontation to exist. It requires presence. It requires the quiet insistence of making a decision and letting it stand. Even when questioned, even when met with concern, even when it would be easier to defer. This clarity does not demand that you reclaim everything at once. That would be performative. It would invite resistance. True clarity is internal. It changes how you answer questions, how you pause before agreeing, how you allow silence to exist when someone expects compliance. You realize that the most powerful boundary is not spoken. It is assumed. When you assume your right to decide, others adjust. Not immediately, sometimes not comfortably. But assumption has gravity. It pulls behavior toward it, just as hesitation once did. You understand that you do not need to justify every choice. Justification invites negotiation. Negotiation implies shared authority. There are moments when shared authority is appropriate, but there are moments when it quietly erodes self-respect. Clarity is knowing the difference. You begin to notice how often you softened your language to make others comfortable, how often you framed decisions as preferences rather than choices, how often you asked permission when none was required. These habits were adaptive. They preserved harmony, but they also taught others how to treat you. Clarity allows you to see these patterns without judgment, to recognize them as strategies that once served you and now require adjustment. You are not becoming rigid. You are becoming precise. You are not reclaiming youth. You are reclaiming authorship. You see that autonomy is not loud. It does not argue. It does not announce itself. It is felt in how you move through the world, in the calm certainty with which you choose, in the absence of apology, in the refusal to over-explain. You realize that even now, even after loss, even after repositioning, nothing essential has been taken unless you agree that it has. Others can manage logistics. They can influence routines. They can shape environments. But they cannot reach inside you unless you invite them. Clarity reveals that internal authority was never dependent on role, productivity, or usefulness. Those things once amplified it, but they did not create it. And losing them does not require losing yourself. You understand now why resistance felt wrong. Resistance assumes an enemy. There is none. What is required is alignment. Alignment between what you know internally and how you act externally. When those align, authority returns quietly. You stop waiting to be asked. Not in every situation, not aggressively, but in moments that matter. You offer your decision rather than your opinion. You state what you will do rather than what you prefer. You let others react without managing their reaction. Clarity teaches you that discomfort is not danger. Others may feel uneasy when they realize you are still deciding. That unease does not need to be resolved. It needs to be tolerated. Just as you tolerated the discomfort of being managed, you recognize that autonomy lives in the smallest moments. In choosing when to leave, in choosing how long to stay, in choosing what to ignore, in choosing what deserves your energy. These choices do not require permission. They require recognition. You see that dignity is not preserved by compliance. It is preserved by congruence, by acting in accordance with your internal sense of self, even when external cues suggest you should defer. Clarity is quiet because it does not seek validation. It does not need agreement. It does not need to be understood. It is sufficient unto itself. You understand now that what cannot be taken unless surrendered internally is not control over outcomes, but ownership of choice. Others can influence outcomes, they always could, but choice remains yours as long as you inhabit it. This understanding settles. It does not rush. It does not demand immediate change. It simply rearranges your internal posture. You stand differently now, not taller, just more centered, and from that center, everything else will adjust. The posture changes without announcement. There is no decision to reclaim anything, no declaration of independence, no moment where you inform the world that something has shifted. Quiet autonomy does not need witnesses. It is internal first, and internal almost entirely. Others notice only its effects, and often they do not name them correctly. You stop rushing to explain yourself. Not because you are withholding, but because explanation no longer feels necessary. You answer questions plainly. You let statements stand without cushioning them. When someone offers an alternative to your decision, you listen without adjusting. You do not argue, you do not defend, you simply remain where you are. This is not defiance, it is composure. You notice that when you speak with certainty, the conversation changes, not always comfortably. There is a brief pause, a recalibration. People adjust their footing. They realize that the role they had quietly assigned to you no longer fits. Some will test this. They will reframe concern. They will reintroduce safety. They will ask again, in a different tone. You do not escalate. You repeat yourself or you do not. Silence becomes an answer you allow to exist. Quiet autonomy is not about reclaiming control over others. It is about releasing the need to manage their reactions. You no longer soften choices to make them easier to accept. You no longer preemptively reduce yourself to avoid discomfort. You allow others to feel what they feel without rushing to soothe it. You become selective with engagement, not withdrawn but deliberate. You decide where your input is necessary and where it is not. You no longer fill space to prove relevance. You do not offer opinions to remain included. You participate when it aligns, and you step back when it does not. This is not disengagement, it is discernment. You notice that autonomy feels different at this stage of life. It is not expansive. It is not loud. It does not seek novelty, it seeks integrity. Alignment between what you think, what you choose, and what you allow. The satisfaction is quieter, but deeper. It does not depend on validation. You stop accepting help automatically. Not by refusing it, but by choosing it. There is a difference. Help offered becomes help accepted only when it aligns with your intention. Otherwise, it passes without ceremony. You thank, you decline, you move on. No explanation required. You begin to see that many people confuse compliance with peace. They believe that smooth interactions mean harmony, but harmony built on erasure is fragile. Quiet autonomy creates a different kind of peace, one that tolerates brief tension in exchange for long-term coherence. The tension fades, the coherence remains. You feel your internal authority return not as confidence, but as steadiness. You trust yourself again, not because circumstances improved, but because you stopped outsourcing trust. You remember that judgment is not proven by outcomes alone. It is proven by ownership, by standing with your choices regardless of how they unfold. You no longer wait for invitations to exist fully. You do not require permission to decide how you spend your time, your energy, your attention. You choose without performance, without announcement, without resistance. This quietness confuses some. They expect friction. They expect explanation. Instead, they encounter certainty. Quiet autonomy does not isolate you. It clarifies relationships. Some become simpler. Some become more distant. A few become deeper. You accept this without narrative, without interpreting it as loss. Alignment naturally reorganizes proximity. You let it. You notice how dignity returns when you stop negotiating your presence, when you allow yourself to be as you are without adjusting for comfort. Dignity does not demand respect. It attracts it quietly and repels those who require your diminishment to feel secure. You begin to experience freedom differently than you imagined years ago. It is not the freedom of unlimited choice. It is the freedom of self-possession, of knowing where you stand and not abandoning that position to make life easier for others. You still care. You still consider. You still listen. Quiet autonomy does not harden you. It refines you. You choose compassion without surrender. You offer flexibility without erasure. You engage without disappearing. There is a calm in knowing that no one needs to understand your choices for them to be valid. Understanding is not a prerequisite for autonomy. It is a preference you release. You let others misinterpret you if necessary. You no longer correct every misunderstanding. Clarity inside makes external clarification optional. You move through the world with less urgency to be accommodated and more patience to be yourself. You allow routines to exist without letting them define you. You accept assistance without letting it replace you. You participate without handing over authorship. Quiet autonomy does not restore the past. It does not recreate earlier versions of yourself. It does something more honest. It anchors you fully in who you are now. Not diminished, not exaggerated, just intact. You understand that autonomy at this stage is not about proving capacity. It is about inhabiting authority. Authority over your inner life. Over what you agree to, over what you tolerate, over what you ignore. These choices accumulate. They rebuild a sense of self that cannot be managed by others unless you allow it. There is no final moment where this completes. Quiet autonomy is not a destination. It is a stance, one you return to again and again whenever the world attempts to rearrange you for convenience. You notice sooner now. You adjust earlier. You remain closer to yourself. You do not announce this shift, you live it. And in doing so, you reclaim what retirement was never meant to take from you. Not activity, not relevance, not strength, but authorship, silently, fully, on your own terms.